What's up, everybody? It's Anand from UnderdarkStrength.com, and today I have a very special guest for you guys. It's none other than Ian McCarthy of Lifting for Life. I've been following Ian ever since he started on YouTube, and he's been a major influence on me in becoming a coach myself. Ian was one of the first people on YouTube to be so outspoken when it comes to evidence-based fitness information, and I believe that to this day, he's had a major influence on the whole evidence-based fitness community. So in this interview, I was hoping that we could all learn from him about his training techniques, his approach to nutrition, the latest evidence-based recommendations that he has. But this interview turned out to be even more interesting than I initially expected, and this is because we had a great talk about mental health, and this is an issue that Ian has been more and more interested in recently, and the same thing goes for myself. So I recently wrote an article and made a video called "How Fitness Can Help You Master All Other Areas of Your Life." And while I was researching that, I came across a lot of interesting research that linked a lot of mental disorders to a sedentary lifestyle. On the other hand, when it comes to people who are active, physical activity tends to improve a lot of the mental disorders that people have. So we had a really good discussion on the whole mental health thing, and by no means, I'm an expert in this field, but Ian has a lot of knowledge in this field, and I'm sure that you will get a lot of value out of this. I hope you enjoy this interview, and if you like this interview, please go ahead and hit the subscribe button down below. And if you have any other guests that you would like me to get on this show, then make sure to leave a comment below. With that, let's get started with this interview with Ian McCarthy. What's up, everybody? It's Anand from Underdark Strength, and today I'm super excited to bring to you none other than Ian McCarthy of Lifting for Life. Hey Ian, how's it going?
Going really well. Happy to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Thank you for taking the time today and giving me this opportunity to chat with you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So Ian, for the one or two people who may not know who you are, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So, as has been mentioned, my name is Ian McCarthy. I became popular originally. People initially knew who I was as a function of my YouTube channel, Lifting for Life, and my Facebook page, No Bullshit Bodybuilding. And I really kind of suddenly became popular in 2012 as a function of publicly criticizing a number of people who were popular in the YouTube fitness community, which is a phrase I don't often see anymore, but it was very popular at the time. And really my perception was, and this was in mid or even early 2011 when I first discovered that scene, I was very concerned because I perceived it as not being evidence-based. I didn't even have that vocabulary yet, but I'm able to use it in hindsight. And I felt that things that were being said, things that were being done and recommended by folks who were putting out content at the time was, they may have even had the right intentions. That's not really something I can speak to, but I perceived the actual claims being made as overwhelmingly arbitrary, and my perception was that if those people could do that, then I could do it, and I could do it better. So, and I, as a function of being a young, even younger person at that time, I was going to say a young person, but I'm young now, a very young person, and having the arrogance and the ignorance that comes, and all of that comes along with being the quintessential 17-year-old male at the time. I really thought, I believed myself to have the singular answer and them not, and I think that was mistaken. However, that approach resulted in folks paying attention, and admittedly a lot of people really disliking what I was doing, understandably, but a lot of people also it penetrating on some level. In fact, I've had numerous people say they initially saw my stuff, they thought who is this pencil-necked geek? Like, who cares? Why is he talking about bodybuilding? Why would I pay attention? But that in time, they changed their mind. And in fact, there was so much pushback, but a lot of the things I was talking about, let's take if it fits your macros / flexible dieting, extremely controversial for probably 2 years. And it's now gotten to the point where I overwhelmingly am uninterested in talking about it because I perceive the topic as having been overwhelmingly exhausted within the fitness community. Now, it still hasn't penetrated the mainstream in the way I would like to or would be ideal, but it feels a very there's not additional material to offer on that point. But again, this is an overly long explanation. That speaks to how attitudes changed over time. I started coaching in 2014. That became my primary focus for about 2 years. So I became less focused on YouTube. There was a significant period of time in which I didn't make videos. Then I came back, and I'm not currently making videos either. So yeah, admittedly, my focus varies. At this point, as a function of my own experience and I would say increasing self-awareness and decreasing concern with how people might respond, I've been talking indescribably more about mental health because, again, that's something with which I've struggled. I think it's incredibly important. I think I don't want to be disrespectful toward or dismissive of people who just stick in the lane of talking about nutrition, let's say, or nutrition and training. And I have enormous respect for someone like Brett Contreras, who's crazily passionate about exercise science. I do feel, though, that if you're talking to someone and they're having issues with nutrition, but then it turns out that they actually have a binge eating disorder, there's an additional level of depth there that is tremendously important, needs to be talked about more, recognized more, better understood. There's so much work to be done there, and that's where I find myself. I naturally gravitate toward that more now. So this is a transition period, let's say, for me.
That's really that's really awesome, and it's this field is pretty fascinating to me as well. Although I haven't really dug into it as much as you have, but lately I have been kind of looking more into things like the psychology, and I like that you mentioned mental health because two of my favorite musicians, like they committed suicide like within the past 2 months. One was Chris Cornell of Soundgarden, and then more recently Chester Bennington of Linkin Park. And it's both of these guys are like super successful and everything, and if you see some of the comments online, they're so negative that how can they do this, and they left their children or whatever. But it's like people have absolutely no idea what they're talking about.
Yeah, I completely agree, and the truth is that I wasn't the gentleman you mentioned from Soundgarden. I'm other than you just mentioning him, I'm unfamiliar with, but certainly anyone killing themselves is the language isn't adequate to describe how profoundly negative it is. Now, with regard to the Chester, whose last name I'm suddenly not recalling, yeah, that was, pardon?
Bennington.
There we go. Thank you. Fantastic memory, obviously. It was really striking seeing that, and I was overwhelmingly, I try to be really careful about, when someone kills themselves, first and foremost, it's a tragedy. And I think it's important to be wary of immediately going into, I'm trying to think of what the appropriate word would be here. the first response, actually, in my mind at least, shouldn't be to immediately go to talking about mental health broadly or suicide broadly. The first response is the tragedy of the death of that person. And I was very moved by the response there. I think that, frankly, he was just so recognized. Linkin Park being as popular as they are meant that got just incredible penetration. And I was overwhelmingly pleasantly surprised by the response. I didn't see much in the way of negativity, but I think that when people say something like, how can he do this? He has 6 children. I do think that comes from a place of not understanding, the mind of the suicidally depressed person. But I can also empathize with it in the sense that, he actually did leave behind 6 children. I think that really, to get to the heart of it, the question is, do you think that he didn't know that? And can you imagine? And the answer is no, but think about it, how bad things would have to be for one to be aware of that. Okay, I have 6 children, and I have, I was going to say some obligation, a huge obligation to them and to their welfare and so on, but it's still bad enough that I'm going to do this. And I think really trying to hammer the understanding and speaking to the experiential side of things like depression, anxiety, bipolar can be enormously helpful, because certainly science is tremendously important. Hopefully in time there will be such profound improvements in that area that maybe we get to the point where there is a vaccine for depression. I mean, really stretching, that sounds absurd in the context of what we know, but maybe we're able to do genetic sequencing of children and determine that they have certain predispositions to depression, and we can alter gene expression so that they're no longer predisposed. Who knows what it might be. So again, I think that's incredibly important, but I think when it comes to people in culture broadly, having a grasp of what this means, I really think that the people just talking about what it is they've experienced is paramount. And there's a TED Talk entitled something like "Depression: The Secret We Share." Unfortunately, I can't. This is like one of the 2 go-to lectures I always mention when it comes to depression. Unfortunately, I'm not remembering the name of the gentleman who did that either, but he's a journalist, not a neuroscientist, not a psychotherapist, but he speaks to his own experience of depression, and it's very striking. I don't think any person with the functional emotions is able to watch that and not empathize and have a greater depth of understanding of what this means. So I think hopefully that's something I have to offer, and that's I've been talking much more about it because it's funny, people will say they are impressed by my courage in talking about it or something along these lines, and I very frequently get private or direct messages from people who don't comment on that content publicly. And look, I don't desire to be dismissive of someone else perceiving what I'm doing as courageous, but I can't remember a point at which I explicitly decided this, but it has become true that I don't care about the stigma. I'm not sure how much I feel there even is one. And again, I wouldn't want to be dismissive of the person who does have, let's say, depression, and they do feel stigmatized, because that is their perception, and that's it's legitimate, at least as something they're experiencing subjectively. But I've gotten almost entirely positive response, even from the people who say, I don't know what that feels like, but I'm glad you're talking about it.
Yeah, and I recently wrote an article called, How Fitness Can Help You Master All Other Areas of Your Life. And I was mostly talking about my personal experiences, how, ever since I started on my fitness journey, how the other areas of my life have also improved, like things such as, I learned things like goal setting and all those kind of things. But then I even came across some research studies that said, that a sedentary lifestyle is associated with a lot of mental disorders. And on the other hand, any kind of physical activity tends to improve a lot of these. So what's your experience been like with these?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. I think the scientific evidence behind it is overwhelming, and the anecdote is similarly overwhelming. One phrase I've really grown to like this year is simply everything matters, which is interesting because at the same time, I've grown to like the phrase everything matters and also almost nothing matters. And here's what I mean by that. Everything matters is it can be easy to get lazy and kind of leave the 5% on the table perpetually, but that when that becomes systematic, it actually starts to count for a lot more than you think. So to try to give a specific example of this, I got big, I started talking a lot about #daily walks last year, and yeah, just walking outside, genuine low intensity cardio for 20 minutes a day can make a difference. I know of research where that was found to be the threshold for improvements in cognition. So 20 or more minutes had an effect, less than that didn't. And that's 1/72 of a day. And that's the kind of thing that's easy to just write off and watch Netflix. To briefly touch on the almost nothing matters point, because it's mostly off topic, but just to clarify my thoughts on this, that kind of comes at it from the angle of outside of, I was told, I haven't confirmed this, but Freud said life is love and work, and that actually really resonates with me. So I think on a higher level, there are just a handful of things that make life matter. But then in terms of, if we ask questions like how are you going to optimize your health, how are you going to be maximally successful, etc., all the little things can definitely accumulate. And to more directly address the point of mental health and exercise, yeah, I'm actually less familiar with the literature on this than I'd like to be, I'm realizing. But my understanding is that independent effects of resistance training and cardiovascular exercise have been shown, which you also see with just purely physical health effects. So to put this very simply, there's just, if someone does not engage in resistance exercise on a regular basis and cardiovascular exercise of some kind on a regular basis, that just very, very, very much does not make sense to me, because they are flatly missing out on something that allows for, it's not enough to guarantee, but it allows for optimal physical and mental well-being. And as someone who struggled with mental health issues, I almost put, in fact, I think I'll just say, I think I actually do put mental health ahead of physical health. Because I very much agree with the neuroendocrinologist Robert Sapolsky, who said depression is the worst illness you can have, because it just destroys everything. I mean, it like very profound depression is excruciating to experience subjectively, as an emotional state. Basically, it has very severe physical effects, and then it has behavioral implications that destroy all of your relationships, assuming that it's sustained. So in my mind, I think I've realized that mental health needs to be the number one priority, like my personal mental health, and I couldn't have gotten on this podcast without being in the appropriate mental space. And certainly, it's even more broad than just exercise. There was even a pilot study published earlier this year, which I think I talked about on Facebook. I did a brief review of it. To my knowledge, there's only ever been one proper intervention type study with a control group on the effects of healthy diet on depression. They compared, basically depressed subjects were told very straightforward recommendations like decrease your ingestion of sugar, increase your ingestion of monounsaturated fats like olive oil or sources of monounsaturated fats. And I think there were food logs involved. It wasn't even super invasive. And that was compared to a control group where basically people got together and like played games or something. That was the best, approximation they had for a control group. And the dietary intervention group did significantly better. So again, all of these things are intertwined. And the person who, there are seemingly people who being depressed is like incomprehensible to them, and they can be like 400 pounds and never exercise and just eat junk constantly and not even sleep that much. And, they might not feel great, like they might be sleep deprived, but depression like isn't, whatever really underlies depression, they don't have it. But for the people who are predisposed to it or already have it, I think that's very important. And I also think something I think about a lot is really the breadth of these issues in terms of the percentage of people who experience them, because almost every single person with whom I've spoken or to whom I've spoken recently, like once they get a little bit more comfortable and they're not just having a discussion with a stranger, it is incredibly striking to me how much comes out of bipolar disorder, depression, anxiety, generalized anxiety. Someone will be fearful of being in public. They are scared of speaking. They have like severe anxiety relating to public speaking. I made a number of posts on my Instagram story recently about borderline personality disorder, which is a very destructive personality disorder and the most common in women. I had multiple people message me and say, almost all of these symptoms fit me, like meaning them. Or like, I dated someone who clearly who acted like this and it was terrible. And so I think that the knowledge at the popular level is improving, but there's still so much room for improvement that a lot is happening that people don't understand because they don't have the knowledge of psychology to be able to say, someone does nothing but lie in bed and cry for 6 weeks. If someone doesn't have the vocabulary of that's clinical depression, they might just be like, why doesn't this person just get up and like go to work? Like that's what I do. What's going on? Just get up and go to work. Knowledge is. I'm reminded of the phrase "knowledge is power." Knowledge is what allows people to improve their own lives and then hopefully help others improve theirs too.
Right. And if someone wants to learn more about these topics, where would you suggest they start?
Google.
Okay.
No, I mean, that was just my immediate thought, and I really think, certainly the internet is a double-edged sword. I'm sure you can find websites where they say depression is fabricated by pharmaceutical companies to sell SSRIs or something like this. I think, but it's striking how much if someone wants to, they've never heard of borderline personality disorder until now and they want to know what that looks like. Google borderline personality disorder diagnostic criteria DSM-5.
Okay.
And it'll probably be the first hit, and then they can just read it. And it's about 5 pages of diagnostic criteria, deliberately written in intelligible language. Or it might be depression, and then they can Google major depression and look at similar deal. You could do major depressive disorder diagnostic criteria and see, okay, this is what it means for someone to have major depression. I think, maybe a better answer is, I think a really good just one piece of content that I genuinely believe every single person should watch, Robert Sapolsky did a lecture on depression at Stanford, 2009. So yeah, almost 10 years ago, where it's like a 45-minute or 50-minute lecture where he talks both about the biological components or aspects of depression and the psychological components. And, certainly there's controversy, but that lecture, available on YouTube, makes for the best single summary of what depression is and what causes it of anything I've ever seen. And so just watching that could take someone from no understanding of depression to pretty good understanding in less than an hour.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm going to link that down in the description below for anyone who's interested.
Definitely. But yeah, beyond that, a lot of what you're asking someone who's learned a lot through, oh, I've never heard of histrionic personality disorder. Okay, so I Google that and I see maybe I read Wikipedia initially, and then you can follow references there. But yeah, I think if you think sufficiently critically and then try to cross-reference things and try to look for scientific sources for claims being made, etc., you're pretty good. Yeah, it's interesting actually. Quick aside, I'm really not sure how much misinformation I've seen in this area now that I think about it. Because the thing about, pharmaceutical companies made this up to sell SSRIs. I mean, again, I'm sure someone believes that. I think I see much more of that relating to something like attention deficit disorder, much less so depression. It might be that with something like attention deficit disorder, a lot of people conceive of it as being 8-year-old kid, can't pay attention, wants to play Nintendo. Well, I guess I'm aging myself. People don't play Nintendo anymore. They have an iPhone or whatever. And people will say, come on, like, that's just normal kid stuff. Kids don't want to sit in a chair for 8 hours. Which I understand why people are have that view. I also think that that's also based on an incomplete understanding of ADD. I think with something like depression, when people experience it or see people experiencing it, they can't be like, that's normal kid stuff, that's totally fine. Again, if you have someone who hasn't bathed in 2 weeks because they don't feel like they're too fatigued and to even get out of bed, that, again, some people will respond to that with a kind of, why don't you just get up, dude? What's going on? But I think that there comes a point where it's bad enough that even someone who has never researched this, they've not experienced it, and this is their first encounter with it, they get that it's a disease state. It's, something is very, very wrong. Indeed, the gentleman I mentioned who's, his name is Andrew Solomon, journalist who has experienced depression and written about it extensively. He said that the moment that he realized things were wrong for him was he had either been sitting on the couch or lying in bed for something like 4 hours with the intention of getting up to make something to eat, and he was unable to do that. Wow. He sincerely intended to do it, and he could not. And he said that he eventually was able to get to his phone, and he called his father and he said, something's really wrong here. So yeah, I think that at some point you can't write it off,
Right. I think there's a lot more misinformation when it comes to fitness, because if you were to Google even simple things like how to lose weight, you find there's so much misinformation out there, people trying to sell you stuff. So yeah, I mean, like you said, there might be less misinformation when it comes to mental health, probably because it's not, I don't think it's a market where people want to sell you supplements and stuff, not yet at least.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point to bring up. So first, with regard to the selling supplements, yeah, I think that I'm not sure I've even ever seen, barring something like St. John's wort supplements sold with the intention of treating depression. I imagine I would be very surprised if a big component of that isn't companies would just get sued into the ground, or the FDA would heavily penalize them, because it's one thing to sell creatine, this increases lean body mass, and another thing to sell a supplement claiming it's going to treat depression. Yeah. I mean, the thing about the FDA has not assessed these claims is very significant. I also think the actual or perceived stigma might definitely prevent some people from talking about it. I also think, and I don't, it is very easy to kind of write off every person on Instagram who looks amazing as just looking amazing and having great genetics and being marginally intelligent and best and so on. And I don't want to put, I don't want to put every person who looks great and has a successful Instagram account in that box. I do think that stereotypes like that do not arise out of nothing. So I think that I endeavor not to look at, let's say content on Instagram that I perceive as being low quality coming from people who maybe don't know any better, because that doesn't benefit me, it doesn't benefit them, it doesn't benefit their audience. But when I do see it, I see a major phenomenon of people being just knowledgeable enough and just intelligent enough to basically fake it. Like, I don't think that they have, as soon, and I've directly experienced this, as soon as you ask moderately substantive questions, their responses become devoid of, they just clearly have a very superficial understanding. I think with something like depression, the bar is just higher. Right. What is someone going to say who doesn't get it? You're depressed, like drink more water. I don't know. Now I might be coming at this from the perspective of someone who has a moderately good knowledge of it, but for me, it's very evident if someone gets it or doesn't. It's almost dichotomous. Like, some people have very little understanding of depression. And fortunately, in my experience, those people are typically very open and they say, I don't understand. And then there are people who have clearly experienced it, or their loved ones have, and they just know what it is. And they know how severe it is and how resistant to treatment it can be, and how it's not about trying to maintain a positive attitude, pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps, having a good work ethic, etc. Just to speak like a little bit more personally than what much of this discussion has been, something I didn't fully internalize until recently, I think because of my depression, is I have an above average work ethic. I actually have to consciously decide to do something like go to a movie and sit in a movie theater for 2 or 2.5 hours and watch a movie. I have to put conscious effort into doing that, because I think it's something I need to do to be a more balanced human being. Whereas reading or responding to people, or and anything that I perceive as vaguely in the category of productive, I do that by default. I'm uncomfortable not doing that. However, when I'm at my most depressed, it like reduces all of that to like 5% of my capacity. And it's so important to recognize, it's important for me to recognize as a matter of being objective about myself, but also others to recognize, not really, this isn't just about me, but it's about understanding depression. You might have someone who at their best is incredibly caring, incredibly, like, the most kind and gracious person you'll ever meet, and then they might have a bout of depression that is very severe for 2 weeks, let's say, and this varies tremendously between people. It might be 2 days. It might be 2 weeks. It might be a much longer bout. And that takes them from being the most gracious person you've ever seen to they basically can't do anything. They can't do anything for anyone because they're so immobilized. And that But that's different to someone who's never kind and never gracious and exclusively selfish and destructive of other people and so on. And I mean, admittedly, in that case, we're probably looking at a personality disorder, and then you can get into are they responsible and so on, which is opens up a huge topic. But again, there's a distinction between that and someone who, when they're really themselves, they're great, and when they're depressed, they just aren't. They're not themselves. They're sick. Just like, I don't think there's a perfect analogy to be made between something like depression and, let's say, leukemia, because I do think there's a substantial amount of cognitive override that can be used as a means of treating depression. That's the whole principle which underlies cognitive therapy, which is widely regarded as the gold standard for depression. But I think there's an analogy to be made in that if your sister has severe depression, and let's even say diagnosed, it's unequivocally there, and she's normally a good student, really cheerful, helpful, and all of these things, and she's failing out of school and not eating and can't engage with anyone and all of this. They're not themselves in the way that you might have someone who's naturally unbelievably energetic and physical and strong, and they develop a very destructive physical illness and they become immobile. I wouldn't think to say that is an immobile person, that's part of their nature. So yeah, I'm unsure where I got, how I got to this point in the discussion, but I do think that that's something that's clarifying and it would just really help the world if everyone got that. It would help depressed persons understand what they're experiencing, and it would help those who are not depressed understand what's happening and empathize and ultimately assist, and make decisions that are actually helpful and may help someone get out of that space, as opposed to coming at it from the more judgmental angle, which is, it can be very intuitive. And I mean, trust me, depressed people think that about themselves. The person who can't move and can't eat and all of this because of depression. I mean, what do you think that they are thinking about themselves? It's exclusively negative. That's I would say both a cause and effect, probably. I spent a lot of time trying to figure that out, of depression. And at the very least, my hope would be we can get rid of that as kind of a thought. The thing Chester Bennington was selfish, uncaring and all of this. I mean, it isn't as if I knew him, and I, so I want to be careful not to say kind of, too much or too little, but people love their children. The fact that he killed himself does not mean he didn't love his children. It means that, bringing back the original point, that's the level of suffering he was experiencing. And if people can at least attempt to grasp that, even if they won't ever know what that feels like, that will scrape away a lot of the just junk kind of dialogue that's happening that doesn't benefit anyone. Right. And then we can get a little more into, this is what it is, and oh, by the way, here, this is what we can do about it.
Right. And then, for the past year or so, I after seeing some of your posts on meditation, I've been meditating regularly. And as a kid, I was kind of introduced to meditation, but I never really paid attention to it, because I grew up in India, so meditation is traditionally pretty big over there.
Mm-hmm.
But I saw that you were using Calm, the app, at that time, and I started using it, and now I can't even imagine not meditating, because what I found and what others have found is that it's like when you stop meditating, you see all the effects that you're missing out on. So for me, as an example, of the days that I don't meditate, I'm I'm a lot less productive. My focus is like all over the place. I'm not able to concentrate. Whereas if I meditate for like even 5 minutes, it makes like a night and day difference.
Yeah. I
So
mean, go ahead.
yeah, so I wanted to know, your experience with meditation and how it's been so far.
Absolutely. So I would first say that I perceive myself as very, very, very far away from an expert in this. I think I'm far away from an expert in almost anything, but something like depression, I've put much more time and energy into than almost anything else. I probably know the most in life about film music, if anyone's curious. But with regard to meditation, I actually can't recall what got me in it initially. Actually, I think it was a combination of an old friend of mine, Jared Bickler, got into it. He was talking about it. This was maybe late 2015, early 2016. Was talking about it a bit, and it having been beneficial. And initially, I was like, yeah, I was pretty dismissive. Is I think I was vaguely aware of meditation for, I guess, really my whole life. I mean, it is popular enough that, a 10-year-old kid is probably vaguely aware of it. And I just always, I think, wrote it off as, I'm not sure I even really had a reason. It's just closed-mindedness. Contempt prior to investigation, as my mother said to me many times as a child. And then I recall that Jeff Nippard in a video like 2.5 years ago now mentioned that he used Calm. And so that was in my brain, like the fact that app existed. And I can't remember the proximal trigger, but I think I started in April or May of last year. And the first month I did it like 20 times, but I think that even by the second month, I was doing it pretty much every day. And I think the best I ever did was like 180 days consecutively. Now, interestingly at this point, and this is a broad thought to bring up, in the tail end of this discussion, but something I've really been thinking about over the past few days, and I'm very curious to see how it pans out over the next, whether it's even the next week or the next 15 years of my life. But I've grown increasingly compelled by the concept of something like coping by not coping. In other words, you experience something unpleasant, subjectively, an emotion, and rather than endeavoring to do something, go for a walk, eat something, so on, to change that, you accept it and you wait for it to go away. Now, two thoughts occur there. First of all, that isn't completely, that can be used as a tool along with everything else. So if you're starving and you also feel very upset, I'm not saying you should not eat, but I'm saying, last night for about an hour I had anxiety. I was unable to discern a cause for it, and I eventually just decided to sit with that, and then it went away after an hour. But my second thought is, I originally meant this as kind of an explanation of why I have actually stopped meditating recently, because a major issue that I deal with is called rumination. That's the technical term for it. It's basically like obsessive negative thinking. So it's like only negative, and it's very persistent and difficult to stop. And interestingly, there are, I'm trying to think how best to phrase this. There are relevant similarities between depression and obsessive-compulsive disorder. Indeed, to my knowledge, SSRIs can be used successfully to a limited degree in treating OCD, as with depression. And I see that in the obsessive negative thinking component of it. Sometimes meditation does not work for me because I find that in, trying to use it as an opportunity to sit and think certain things, experience certain things, it actually opens the door strangely for me for rumination. And in that case, I'm actually better off doing something like listening to a really engaging piece of music because then it's external. But the other thought I was going to mention is, you have anxiety and you decide, all right, I'm just going to accept that I have it. I mean, that might actually just be a mindfulness technique. I'm realizing. I would say that, depression, when it works for me, which has been the majority of the time, I agree. It without opening up this broad, huge topic of whether or not we have free will, it increases my subjective experience of what I would call, conscious control over both what I'm doing and thinking. So again, when it works, it's easier to focus and not be distracted. It's easier to respond to things positively. I have a higher irritability threshold, like kind of the default is put in a better position. When stressful things happen, the stress response is diminished. It's systematically better. Indeed, I even had someone, I will never forget this because it was so unique what they said. They said that they could tell from my Snapchat stories when I was meditating versus not. Because when I was meditating, I was just so much more pleasant in them. And that really struck me. It's like, it's one thing to, you meditate and like you feel, you can focus a bit better on work or something, which someone else might notice. But when, someone on the internet just watching some clips of you on Snapchat is able to be like, oh, you're meditating. Oh, you're not meditating. In my mind, that's a striking behavioral change, which, it takes like, with apps like Calm, and I now use Headspace, although honestly I might go back to Calm for, temporarily for the sake of novelty. Yeah, you're talking a 10-minute investment, and it can be, the benefits can be very disproportionate to that.
Right. So, what are your short-term and long-term goals with Lifting for Life?
I'm unsure, and part of this is I have things going on the back end that I can't yet talk about, which is like, it's frustrating for me, but I also know how frustrating that is as any kind of consumer of content, because seemingly everyone always has 17 big things coming, and then they either don't come or they're much smaller than the hype made them out to be, and so on. But again, I do have stuff on the back end that is like actually occurring, it's solidifying and so on, but it just hasn't gotten to the point yet where I can say more than that. I have a lot, because I do desire to be transparent, but also I don't want to say I'm going to do something that I don't end up doing and so on. Things that I'm thinking about include developing some kind of brand around mental health, like just since I've found myself naturally going in that direction, just going all in, like pursuing that more aggressively. But there's a major kind of caveat there of, to do a lot of what I want to do, I will either need to be a psychotherapist or researcher, which is what I'm going to do. But that's a decade down the road. So I couldn't, things that people are able to do in the fitness industry, still within the realm of legality and so on, are greater because there's less in the way of restriction. So you might be able to write, guide to building muscle mass with greater freedom than guide to treating clinical depression. Because in one case, you're just talking about building muscle mass, and in another case, you're talking about the treatment of a disease. But that's thinking about doing a better job of that, something that would reach more people. I 100% have not worked out the details of that, but it's a possibility. I'm thinking about Lifting for Life, but I'm thinking about really what I want it to be, and where I want to take it, recognizing that I've just naturally found myself thinking less about a lot of the purely fitness related stuff, and I don't want to, try to fit the square peg in the round hole kind of thing, because to be quite frank, that's something that I've done in the past, of attempting to do things thinking that they were what I wanted to do, but it was really someone else's values being expressed. So things are going on, but some of them, again, not there yet, and some of them I need an indeterminate amount of time to figure out what I want them to look like. Also, something that's relevant to this is, for a lot of this time, I either wasn't in school or was very much less focused on it, whereas now it's much more important to me. So, some amount of time and energy and so on that would have otherwise been free to be directed toward whatever it might be, YouTube content, Instagram, and so on, is being directed toward, how am I, when am I going to graduate? What is this timeline going to look like? What are the exact classes? I need, literally created this Google sheet mapping out everything and all of this that, maybe that would have been, that would have otherwise been directed toward writing an article or something. So, only so much time and energy in the day. But I'm definitely, the rhythm I've gotten in, with which I'm pleased, is more or less sharing what I'm doing and as much as I can in a way that is beneficial to people. And I guess I'm realizing that I've been very pleasantly surprised by, the number of people who, you might look at their Instagram and it seems pure fitness, and then they message you and they're talking to you about very thoughtfully and at length about mental health issues that I just wouldn't have even had any clue otherwise. If I hadn't put out there what I have.
Yeah, for sure. So Ian, there's actually, I think there's a lot we can talk about just on this one topic, and there's a lot we can even talk about fitness, but I think that would take like hours and hours. So, but I would love to have you on again sometime.
Yeah, I would be ecstatic to, and my, certainly it's your show, but one way to go that seems very intuitive to me is we could, dedicate an hour to only fitness topics. I'm definitely, I don't want to give the impression I'm not open to that. I still, we'll have lengthy discussions with folks just relating to program design and so on. I think a lot of this is in addition to that, as opposed to, well, now I don't care about any of it.
Right. Yeah, that'd be awesome if we could do that, because there's so much we can talk about.
Absolutely. But, well, thank you again for inviting me.
No, and I really want to thank you for taking the time today. And before you go, could you let us know where people can find you?
Yeah, so that's another thing affected by the big things coming I can't talk about. I would say that the best place to follow me at the moment is Instagram. So Ian Brown McCarthy is my username. And I've really been, because I don't want to force it, I've really been clicking with Instagram stories recently. I haven't been so much using the timeline, and even Facebook I've just found myself less compelled by. So that's where a lot of current stuff is at the moment.
Okay, and I'll link everything down in the description below.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Ian, and hope to see you soon.
Absolutely.
All right, take care. Bye.
You too.
Bye.